He built a career playing a man who never loses, a spy with a gadget for every problem and a comeback for every threat. But off-camera, Pierce Brosnan spent decades fighting something no script, no stunt double, and no clever one-liner could solve. He watched the same disease take his wife, and then, 22 years later, take his daughter too. He is 73 years old now, one of the most recognizable faces in film history, and still, underneath the tuxedo and the charm, carrying a grief most of his fans never fully understood. This is the real story of Pierce Brosnan, not the license to kill, but the cost of living. Pierce Brendan Brosnan was born on May 16, 1953, in Navan, County Meath, Ireland. His father left the family when Pierce was an infant, and by the time he was 4, his mother, May, made the wrenching decision to move to London to train as a nurse, leaving her young son behind in Ireland with relatives while she tried to build a life that could eventually support him. For a boy that young, eventually, can feel like forever. Brosnan was raised in a rotating cast of households, first with his grandparents, then, after they passed away, with an aunt and uncle, and later in a boarding house. Every relocation came with its own quiet adjustment, its own new set of rules, its own reminder that permanence wasn't something he could count on. There were bright spots. He's spoken warmly over the years about the affection of his grandparents and about a landlady's children who became makeshift siblings for a while. But the losses kept stacking. When Brosnan was 11, he finally reunited with his mother in England, where she had remarried a man named William Carmichael. The reunion should have felt like a happy ending. Instead, it introduced a new kind of isolation. An Irish boy dropped into an English school, mocked for his accent, having to defend an identity he hadn't yet learned to be proud of. It was around this unstable, lonely stretch of adolescence that Brosnan first saw Sean Connery on screen as James Bond. He has described it as a formative moment, not because he dreamed of becoming a spy, but because he saw a kind of command and self-possession that felt entirely foreign to a displaced kid still trying to find solid ground. He left school at 16 without much direction, initially drawn to visual art rather than performance. He trained as a commercial illustrator in London before a workshop nudged him toward the stage. 3 years of formal training at the Drama Centre London followed. For someone who had spent his whole childhood being moved, uprooted, and unsettled, acting demanded something almost unnatural, standing still, being watched, being present. Brosnan spent the back half of the 1970s doing the unglamorous work of building a career, regional theater, small television parts, modest pay, steady grind. Playwright Tennessee Williams took notice of him in a 1977 London stage production and offered encouragement, but it would take American television, not British theatre, to make Brosnan a household name. In 1982, Brosnan was cast as the charming con man posing as a private detective in NBC's Remington Steele. The show made him a star in the United States and, by the mid-1980s, put him on the shortlist to inherit the role of James Bond after Roger Moore's departure. In 1986, Brosnan was reportedly close to signing on. But NBC exercised an option to renew Remington Steele for additional episodes, and the contractual window that would have freed him for Bond closed at the worst possible moment. The role went to Timothy Dalton instead. It's the kind of professional heartbreak that would sting under any circumstances. But 1986 held something far heavier for Brosnan than a lost film role. His family was about to face the first of 2 devastating diagnoses that would define the next 3 decades of his life. Brosnan met the Australian-born actress Cassandra Harris in London in the mid-1970s. Harris, who had appeared as a Bond girl herself in 1981's For Your Eyes Only, was already a mother of 2 young children, Charlotte and Christopher, from an earlier marriage. Rather than staying on the periphery of that family, Brosnan became a father figure to both children, formally adopting them after their biological father, Dermot Harris, died in 1986. Brosnan and Harris married in December 1980, and their son Sean was born in 1983. By all accounts, Cassandra was the steady center of the household through the uncertain financial years of Brosnan's early acting career. Then, in 1987, everything changed. While the family was filming together in India, Cassandra began experiencing unusual fatigue and abdominal swelling. The diagnosis was ovarian cancer, the same disease that had already claimed her own mother's life years earlier. It was an early and painful signal that this illness ran through the women in her family, though the science of hereditary cancer risk was far less understood publicly at the time than it is today. Site index equals 4-1. Cassandra battled the disease for 4 years, undergoing 8 operations along with extensive chemotherapy. Site Brosnan later told People magazine, in an interview shortly after her death, that the fight began immediately and never let up. That site index equals 6-1. The cancer had not remained some small, contained thing but had invaded her entire being. Site. It was during this period, while his wife fought for her life, that Brosnan quietly returned to something he'd set aside decades earlier: painting. He'd trained as a commercial illustrator as a teenager before acting took over his life, and now, with words failing him, he picked up a brush again. What started as an attempt to process unbearable emotion became a private, ongoing practice, one he would keep almost entirely hidden from the public for more than 30 years. Painting became the place where fear and grief could exist without needing to be explained to anyone. Site index equals 10-1. Cassandra Harris died on December 28, 1991, at age 43. Site. One day after what would have been the couple's 11th wedding anniversary. She left behind her husband and 3 children, the youngest of whom, Sean, was only 8 years old. 3 years after Cassandra's death, in 1994, Pierce Brosnan was announced as the 5th actor to play James Bond, following Timothy Dalton's departure from the role. GoldenEye arrived in theaters in 1995 after a 6-year hiatus for the franchise, and it became a major commercial success, pulling in over $350 million worldwide, the strongest box office result the series had posted to that point. For an actor who had lost the role once, buried his wife, and spent nearly 2 decades earning his way through modest theater and television work, the moment carried a weight that had nothing to do with box office numbers. But it's worth sitting with the timing here. The role that once symbolized total control and invincibility finally became his in the very years he was learning, in the most painful way possible, that some things simply cannot be controlled. Brosnan would go on to play Bond in 4 films between 1995 and 2002, GoldenEye, Tomorrow Never Dies, The World Is Not Enough, and Die Another Day, cementing himself as one of the most commercially successful actors to hold the role. In 1994, the same year Bond became real again, Brosnan met journalist and environmental advocate Keely Shea Smith at a party in Mexico. Their relationship developed into a genuine partnership. Keely brought her own established career in environmental reporting and coastal conservation work into their life together, rather than folding herself into his. The couple married in August 2001 in County Mayo, Ireland. They welcomed 2 sons, Dylan in 1997 and Paris in 2001, expanding a household that already included Brosnan's adopted children Christopher and Charlotte and his son Sean with Cassandra. Brosnan and Smith have often spoken about their marriage in refreshingly unglamorous terms, describing it less as movie star romance and more as 2 people who genuinely like each other and choose, repeatedly, to solve problems together. Charlotte Brosnan grew into, by every account including her father's, a warm and devoted presence in the family, a mother of 2, Isabella and Lucas, and partner to Alex Smith. Given her mother's and grandmother's history with ovarian cancer, Charlotte had reportedly begun regular medical checkups years earlier because of the family's history with the disease. It didn't matter. Nearly 2 decades after watching the same illness take her mother, Charlotte received the identical diagnosis: ovarian cancer. Site index equals 8-1. She battled the disease for 3 years, site, continuing to raise her children throughout treatment. Weeks before the end, in June 2013, she married Alex Smith, a wedding built not around the luxury of time, but around its near-total absence. Site index equals 10-1. On June 28, 2013, Charlotte Brosnan died in London at age 41, site, surrounded by her husband, her children, and her brothers Christopher and Sean. In a public statement, Brosnan called her his darling daughter and said the family's hearts were heavy with the loss of their beautiful girl, adding that he hoped site index equals 10-1. A cure for what he called this wretched disease would be close at hand soon enough to spare another family the same call. Site. The following year, at the 2014 Stand Up to Cancer broadcast, Brosnan spoke publicly and directly about what it meant to have held 2 different hands through 2 different deaths, decades apart, both taken by the exact same illness. There wasn't much more he needed to say. The audience understood exactly what that kind of loss does to a person twice over. Medical experts who have since discussed the family's case, including gynecologic oncologists interviewed by health outlets, have pointed to the likely role of hereditary genetic factors, the kind of shared risk that runs through generations of women in a family, and underscores why genetic testing and awareness of family history matter so much in ovarian cancer prevention and early detection. Long before Charlotte's death, painting had already become the language Brosnan reached for when words failed. He has said that displaying his work publicly felt more frightening than any film role, because acting always came with the protection of a script, a costume, a character standing between himself and the audience. Painting offered no such shield. That vulnerability is part of why the paintings stayed private for so long. It wasn't until 2023, more than 3 decades after he first picked the brush back up during Cassandra's illness, that Brosnan finally opened his private archive to the public. His debut solo exhibition, So Many Dreams, opened in Los Angeles in May 2023, coinciding with his 70th birthday. Site index equals 17-1, the show presented a retrospective spanning 36 years, from 1987 to 2023, and included roughly 50 paintings alongside around 100 drawings, /site, some made on his phone, plus prints, and a short documentary directed by Tom Zimney and produced by Brosnan's son Dylan. Brosnan has described the work as fundamentally autobiographical, an attempt to capture who he was, where he was, and what he was feeling at different points in his life, in a way he found he simply couldn't manage through writing a traditional memoir. The exhibition doubled, in his own words, as something of a love letter to the women who shaped his life and to the art form that had quietly carried him through the worst of it. Painting also became his instinctive response to sudden grief later in life. When his close friend Anthony Bourdain died in 2018, Brosnan reportedly went straight to his studio rather than giving interviews, painting a portrait of Bourdain that same morning, a pattern of processing loss through canvas rather than conversation that had been set decades earlier at Cassandra's bedside. What's striking about the Brosnan family's story isn't just the repetition of tragedy, it's what grew out of it. Both of Brosnan's younger sons, Dylan and Paris, have pursued creative paths of their own, with Paris in particular building a genuine career across painting and photography, including solo exhibitions of his own work in recent years. Critics have noted the clear influence of his father's decades of private artistic practice. Christopher Brosnan, adopted alongside Charlotte, grew up close to the film industry his father helped define, eventually working on the crew of several of Pierce's own productions, including Tomorrow Never Dies. He was 19 when Cassandra died, old enough to absorb the full weight of that loss in a way his younger siblings were partly shielded from. Brosnan has spoken about the family's efforts to support Christopher through his own struggles in adulthood, describing the hard lesson that love alone cannot force another adult toward recovery. Even so, Christopher has remained a visible, named part of how Brosnan speaks about his family, including in public tributes to his children. Since 2001, Brosnan has served as a UNICEF Ireland ambassador, and since Charlotte's death, he and Keeley have been vocal supporters of ovarian cancer research and awareness efforts, turning a private, repeated catastrophe into public advocacy aimed at sparing other families the same experience. Pierce Brosnan is 73 now. He's still working, recently taking on the very different role of boxing trainer Brendan in the film Giant, trading the polish of a spy for the grit of a very different kind of true story. He's still painting, still opening galleries to a version of himself the public spent decades not knowing existed. Around him is a family built across 2 marriages and immense loss, 5 children, grandchildren, and a body of work stretching from 4 Bond films to hundreds of paintings that sat quietly in storage until he finally decided the world was ready to see them. A boy who grew up learning that the people he loved could disappear without warning became a man who held his wife's hand as she died, and then, 22 years later, did the same for his daughter. In between all of that, somehow, he found a way to turn a lifetime of grief into something people can actually stand in front of and look at. James Bond made Pierce Brosnan famous. But it's the paintings, and the quiet, steady way his family kept choosing to build rather than break, that tell you who he actually is. What part of Pierce Brosnan's story surprised you the most? Let us know in the comments, and if you'd like more real stories behind the actors you grew up watching, subscribe for more.